Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. I was just thinking before we started recording, haven't we all had that feeling, that urge to constantly check our phones, scrolling endlessly, you know what I mean? And time just kind of flies by and you're like, wait, where did the last hour go? Well, today we're going to really dive into that. We're tackling digital addiction head on in this crazy, hyper-connected world we live in.
It's everywhere, isn't it? It really is. I mean, think about it. You pick up your phone to do one thing, and next thing you know, you're down this rabbit hole of, well, who knows what. It's wild.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've got this really cool guide, actually. It's meant for people learning English at an advanced level. But it covers so much ground on digital addiction, from what it actually is to why it even happens to how it affects us and hopefully what we can do about it.
Yeah, it really lays it all out there, doesn't it?
Yeah. And today, we're basically pulling out the gems from this guide for you.
Yeah.
Trying to make it super clear and, understandable without overloading you with information.
Right.
Exactly. Kind of cut through the noise.
Right. So first things first, when we say digital addiction, what are we really talking about? What's the nuts and bolts definition here?
So at its core, digital addiction is when you're using digital devices, phones, tablets, computers, all that compulsively and excessively. But it's got to be to a point where it actually messes with your overall well-being.
So it's not just liking technology, it's affecting your life in a bad way.
Right, exactly. And the guide does a good job of breaking down some key words right off the bat, like compulsive. It means you're basically driven by this irresistible urge to do something. They use this example. He has a compulsive habit of checking his phone every 5 minutes.
Oh, man, that's so relatable. I think we've all seen that, maybe even done that.
Yeah, probably. And then there's screen time, which is pretty straightforward. It's
Right.
literally just the amount of time you spend staring at a screen. I mean, we hear all the time about managing our screen time, and the guide has this simple example. Excessive screen time can disrupt your sleep patterns.
Makes sense. And not just sleep, right? It affects so many things.
Totally. And then there's this other term the guide uses, chronic digital addiction. This is interesting because it refers to a long-term dependence on those devices. It's not just a phase, it's a real problem, especially with teens, the guide says. And chronic really highlights that it's ongoing and really ingrained.
So it's not just being online a lot, it's feeling trapped by it. And it's causing problems in other parts of your life. And speaking of problems, what are some of the the warning signs, the red flags that someone might be struggling with digital addiction?
The guide has a bunch of these, and I bet some will sound familiar, like feeling anxious or just uneasy when you're not online. Does that ever happen to you?
Oh, definitely. When you can't find your phone for a minute?
Totally. Or losing track of time while you're online. You meant to just quickly check something and suddenly, boom, an hour's gone.
Ugh. Just one more video trap.
Exactly. That gets me every time. Then there's ignoring real life stuff, putting off work, chores, you name it, because you're online. And it can even hurt relationships. If you're choosing your phone over spending time with people face to face.
It's you're physically there, but not really present.
Yeah. And then there's sleep, of course. Bad sleep quality is a huge sign, especially if you're on screens right before bed.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, those are all things that can really affect your happiness and well-being overall.
Yeah.
The guide even includes these phrases that, honestly, I think a lot of people have thought or even said out loud.
Oh, yeah, those useful phrases. What are some of your favorites?
I feel disconnected without my phone. It really captures that anxiety,
Yeah, that feeling of being cut off. And this one's interesting, too. Social media is my escape, but it's becoming toxic. Kind of a love-hate thing.
Totally. And then there's the aha moment. I didn't realize how addicted I was until I tried a digital detox. That's when it hits you.
Truth. That's often when you realize how deep the habit goes.
Yeah. And speaking of habits, the guide also has this grammar tip about using the present perfect tense for those ongoing behaviors. I've been spending more time online than I'd like to admit. It emphasizes that it's been going on for a while, which fits with digital addiction being a continuous thing.
That's a good catch. It's subtle but important. I like that they included that.
So we're starting to understand what digital addiction is and how it shows up in our lives. But the big question is, why are these technologies so hard to resist in the first place? What makes them so engaging?
That's where things get really interesting. See, those tech companies, they design their apps and platforms to be super engaging, sometimes even addictive, on purpose.
On purpose.
Yeah, pretty much. They use features like infinite scrolling, so you never really hit a stopping point. Then you've got those push notifications, always grabbing your attention, pulling you back in. And then there's the whole social validation thing, like likes and follower counts. It feeds into our need for connection and approval, you know?
It's like they're hacking our brains to keep us hooked.
Pretty much. It's all very calculated.
And speaking of brains, the guide talks about dopamine. Can you explain what that is and what role it plays in all of this?
So dopamine is like this chemical messenger in your brain that's all about pleasure and reward. When you do something pleasurable, like, I don't know, on a post or win a level in a game, your brain releases dopamine.
Okay.
And that makes you feel good. So you want to do it again and again. The guide says on a post releases dopamine, making the experience addictive.
So those little bursts of validation we get online are actually messing with our brain chemistry, making us crave more. That's kind of scary.
It is a little bit, isn't it? And this leads to what they call a reinforcement loop. It's this cycle where you do something, let's say, check your phone, you get a reward, maybe get a new notification or a funny comment, and that makes you want to check your phone even more.
Like a dog getting a treat for doing a trick.
Yeah, sort of. And the guide specifically says that apps create a reinforcement loop through notifications and rewards. It's all by design.
So every time my phone pings, it's not just an alert, it's like a little reward for my brain, making me want to check it even more.
Exactly. It's like those slot machines, always giving you just enough to keep you pulling the lever.
And the guide has this great phrase: the brain becomes wired to expect instant gratification.
It's true, isn't it? We're so used to getting everything instantly online, it makes it harder to deal with things in real life that take more time and effort.
Definitely. And that brings us to the real-world consequences of digital addiction. It's more than just wasted time, right? It affects our well-being in deeper ways.
Big time. The guide lists some serious stuff, like higher risk of anxiety and depression.
Makes sense. All that comparison and FOMO on social media can't be good for you.
Exactly. Plus, lack of sleep. The blue light from screens really messes with your sleep cycle.
I've definitely noticed my attention span shrinking too.
That's another common one. Our brains get used to the fast pace online, so it's harder to focus on things that take more time and concentration.
Like reading a book, it feels like a chore now.
I know what you mean. And then there's social isolation, which is weird because we think of technology as connecting people.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can have tons of online friends and still feel totally lonely.
Yeah, it's not the same. And it can also strain relationships in real life.
Like if your partner feels like you're ignoring them for your phone.
Exactly. And the guide emphasizes this cause and effect thing. They give examples like, because of his screen addiction, his grades have plummeted, and excessive use of digital devices leads to emotional disconnection.
It's like a domino effect. One thing leads to another. You know, it's so crazy how you can lose track of time online. The other day, I swear, I sat down to check one email and poof, an hour was gone. It felt like I was in a trance or something.
Yeah.
What is it about our brains that allows that to happen?
That feeling is wild, right? It's probably a few things working together. When you're really into something online, your focus narrows, almost like tunnel vision. You lose track of everything else. And the dopamine release we talked about can also warp your sense of time, so it feels like less time has passed than actually has.
So it's like a double whammy of hyperfocus and altered brain chemistry.
Pretty much. It's powerful stuff.
The guide also defines isolation and neglect in this context, which is helpful.
Yeah, isolation is being separated from social contact, and the example is, ironically, social media can lead to social isolation. And then neglect is failing to care for something properly, like she neglected her family while gaming late into the night.
These are real situations people face, which is sad, but important to acknowledge.
Definitely. We touched on instant gratification earlier, but the guide dives deeper into its link with overstimulation. I want to get into that.
Let's do it. So, instant gratification is basically wanting pleasure or fulfillment right away, no waiting. And online platforms are designed to give you that instant reward, like a new message or a funny video.
It's like a constant stream of mini rewards, making it harder to engage with real-life stuff that takes more time and effort to pay off. Like the guide gives this example. I used to enjoy reading, but now I get bored after a few minutes. It's the instant gratification loop.
That's so true. And it makes me wonder, have we ruined our brains for slower, more thoughtful activities?
It's a valid question. I mean, it definitely impacts our ability to focus. And then there's overstimulation, which is basically being bombarded with too much sensory input. All those notifications and updates, it's like our brains are on overdrive all the time.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. And the guide even mentions burnout, specifically for digital stuff, saying that digital burnout is now common among remote workers.
It makes sense. When work and personal life all happen online, the boundaries get blurry and it's harder to disconnect.
It's like you're always on.
Yeah.
The guide also has this great section on key vocabulary, which I think is super important for understanding and talking about this whole digital addiction thing. What are some of the terms that stand out?
There are a bunch of good ones. Doom scrolling, for one. That's when you're just endlessly scrolling through negative or upsetting news online. The example they give is, he was stuck doom scrolling for hours.
Oh, I've been there. It's like a black hole of negativity.
It really is. And then there's FOMO, which stands for fear of missing out. It's that anxiety you feel when you think you're missing out on something everyone else is doing.
Like that feeling when everyone's posting from a concert you're not at?
Exactly. FOMO keeps people glued to their screens, the guide says. It's a powerful force. Then we've got digital detox, which is basically taking a break from all your devices. The example is, I did a weekend digital detox and felt amazing.
That sounds like heaven. Maybe we should try that.
I'm in. There's also algorithmic addiction, which is basically being hooked by the recommendation systems on platforms like YouTube.
So the algorithm is choosing content for you based on what you've watched before, and then you get sucked in.
Exactly. YouTube's algorithmic addiction keeps viewers online for hours, the guide says.
I wonder if that's actually a good thing, though. I mean, you're getting content you like, but does it also limit you to seeing only one perspective? Like, does it create a filter bubble?
That's a great point, and I think the answer is, yeah, it probably does. The algorithm's goal is to keep you engaged, not necessarily to expose you to different viewpoints. So you might end up in an echo chamber just hearing the same opinions over and over.
Food for thought. So what's the last term?
It's disconnection anxiety, which is that feeling of stress or unease when you can't get online. Like, she experienced disconnection anxiety when traveling without Wi-Fi. It shows how dependent we've become on constant connectivity.
We've really gone through a lot. We've defined digital addiction, spotted the warning signs, talked about the psychology behind it, and looked at the consequences. Now, what does the guide say about solutions? Like, how do we actually create a healthier relationship with technology?
Well, the guide has some practical advice. One big thing is to turn off all those non-essential notifications. That constant buzzing and pinging keeps pulling you back to your phone.
Makes sense. Less distractions.
Right, and setting screen time limits for certain apps or for overall usage can help you be more aware of how much time you're spending online.
That sounds like it takes a lot of self-control.
It does. It's all about self-discipline, which the guide defines as the ability to control one's impulses. They say, digital balance requires self-discipline.
Easier said than done.
Definitely, but it's possible. Other things you can do are designate tech-free zones in your home, like no phones at the dinner table or in the bedroom. It creates boundaries.
I like that, like a sacred space.
Exactly. And you can try using grayscale mode on your phone, which makes the screen less visually stimulating and maybe less tempting.
Huh, interesting.
And finally, the guide really stresses replacing those digital habits with real-life activities, like spending time outdoors, picking up a hobby, or just connecting with people face-to-face.
So rediscovering the joys of the real world. Makes sense. And the guide also gives us some helpful vocabulary related to those solutions, right?
Yes. We already talked about self-discipline, but there's also mindfulness. It's about being fully present in the moment without judging your thoughts or feelings. The guide says mindfulness helps reduce compulsive device use.
So being more aware of your impulses and making conscious choices about how you use technology.
Exactly. And lastly, boundaries, which are limits that define healthy tech use. The example is, setting digital boundaries is key to maintaining mental health.
Boundaries are so important for everything in life.
They really are.
But we covered a lot in this deep dive. Digital addiction is a complex issue, and it's often by design. It affects our well-being in so many ways, from our mental health and sleep to our relationships and attention spans. It's not just about how much time we spend online, but how compulsive it is and the negative effects it has.
That's a great summary. Being aware of the signs, understanding why it happens, and actually taking steps to change our habits, those are all key to finding a healthier balance with technology.
Absolutely. And as always, we want to leave you with something to think about. Consider your own relationship with technology. Think about the good and the bad. Could you make even small changes that would lead to a more mindful and fulfilling life, both online and offline? This deep dive is really just a starting point, and we encourage you to keep exploring this topic on your own. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey, you. Ever wondered if there's a faster smarter way to learn something new. Like maybe there's a secret switch in your brain. You might have come across the idea of learning styles, that you learn best by seeing or hearing or maybe doing.
Yeah, that idea is definitely out there.
Well, today on a deep dive, we're going to take a good look at that whole concept, really dig in, especially when it comes to tackling, say, a new language.
Exactly. We've got some really interesting material here.
We have.
And we're going to explore what these learning styles are supposed to be, look at some popular models.
Right.
And then, really importantly, we're going to see what the actual science tells us. Does tailoring your learning to a specific style actually, work best?
Especially for language learning, yeah. We'll clear up some common misunderstandings, too, maybe bust a few myths.
Definitely. And introduce some alternative ways of thinking about effective learning.
Our goal today is pretty simple, really. Clear, practical insights you can actually use.
Right. To help you figure out if maybe obsessing over your supposed learning style is the key.
Or if there are more powerful strategies you should be focusing on, particularly for language.
So let's jump in.
Okay, let's get started. So first things first. What are learning styles exactly? When people use that term, what do they mean?
That's the perfect place to begin. Basically, the idea is that a learning style is your preferred method for taking in new information.
Taking it in, like absorbing it.
Yeah, absorbing it, and then processing it, understanding it, and crucially, remembering it later, retention.
Okay, our source gives some examples, right? Like, she easily absorbs new vocabulary when listening to podcasts.
Exactly. Or, I struggle to retain grammar rules without daily practice. Those verbs, absorb and retain, are key here.
So the core belief is if I teach you in your style, whether that's visual or auditory or whatever, the information will just stick better. You'll understand it more easily and remember it longer.
That's the fundamental premise, yeah. That matching teaching to style equals better learning. Now, over the years, people have tried to categorize these supposed styles. A couple of models tend to pop up a lot.
Absolutely. The first one our material dives into is the VARK model. VARK. What's that one about?
So VARK is an acronym. It stands for visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic.
Okay.
This model basically tries to sort learners into one of those 4 buckets based on which sense they supposedly rely on most for learning.
Right. So visual learners prefer pictures, things they can see.
Exactly. Pictures, charts, graphs, diagrams. Our source even gives the example. The teacher used a diagram to explain sentence structure. It's about seeing the spatial arrangement of things.
So if you're someone who says, I need to see it to get it, that fits the V in VARK.
That aligns with the visual preference, yes. But, and this is important, that preference doesn't automatically mean you'll learn better if everything's visual. We'll get more into that later.
Gotcha. Okay, what about the A, auditory? People who learn by hearing.
Those are the auditory learners, yep. They're thought to learn best through listening lectures, discussions, audio recordings, maybe even just hearing stuff repeated.
And or reading, writing.
That covers learners who prefer to engage with information through text. So reading articles, books, taking detailed notes, writing summaries, that's their supposed go-to.
And finally, K, kinesthetic. The hands-on learners.
Precisely. Kinesthetic learners are believed to learn best by doing. Through movement, physical activities, manipulating objects, think lab experiments, role-playing, building models.
Okay, that's VARK. Now, the other big one mentioned is Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences.
Ah, yes, Gardner.
That one feels a bit broader, doesn't it?
It is, yeah. It's quite different. Gardner's theory expands the whole idea of intelligence way beyond just, standard academic smarts.
What kinds of intelligences did he propose?
Well, he initially listed 8. Linguistic word smart. Logical mathematical number reasoning smart. Musical, music smart. Bodily kinesthetic body smart. Spatial picture smart. Interpersonal people smart. Intrapersonal self smart. And naturalistic nature smart.
Wow, okay. That is a much wider range.
Uh-huh.
But our source makes a really, really important point about Gardner's theory in this context, right?
Absolutely critical, yes. While Gardner's ideas often get lumped in with learning styles, Gardner himself specifically called them intelligences.
Right, not styles.
Not styles. He was talking about different kinds of human capabilities, strengths, talents, not necessarily specific ways people should be taught.
Okay. That's a common mix-up then.
A very common point of confusion. It's vital to understand that difference. Thinking about your strengths is useful, for sure, but it's not the same as saying, I have bodily kinesthetic intelligence, so you must teach me everything through movement. Gardner didn't advocate for that direct instructional matching.
Okay, super important distinction. So we have these popular ideas, VARK, multiple intelligences, often talked about as learning styles. But what does the actual science say? Is there solid proof that matching teaching to these styles works?
This is where it gets, well, really interesting and maybe a bit controversial for some people. The overwhelming scientific consensus from educational psychologists, neuroscientists, is that there's a real lack of strong evidence supporting the learning styles theory as it's typically applied.
Wow. So even though it feels right, like I just know I'm a visual learner, that feeling, it isn't backed up by data.
Basically, yes. Our material uses the word empirical. Empirical evidence is evidence based on observation on experiments, not just theory.
Okay.
And the source states pretty clearly, there is little empirical evidence supporting the learning styles theory.
So those online quizzes telling me I'm a kinesthetic learner, I shouldn't put too much stock in them for dictating how I must learn.
It's not that your preferences aren't real. You might genuinely prefer learning kinesthetically, but the crucial link that learning only or best in that style leads to better outcomes that link is what lacks empirical support.
That's a really clear statement. And wasn't there a specific study mentioned? A big review?
Yes, exactly. A very influential review from 2008 by Pashler and his colleagues. They looked at tons of studies trying to find evidence for this matching hypothesis.
Well, what did they find?
Their conclusion was pretty definitive. They said, there is no adequate evidence base to justify incorporating learning styles assessments into general educational practice.
No adequate evidence base.
Wow.
Okay, so I might like learning visually. I might feel I learn better that way. But that feeling, that preference, doesn't automatically mean I'm actually learning more deeply or remembering it better if you teach me visually.
That's the key distinction the research highlights. Preferences are real. People definitely have ways they like to learn. But preference doesn't equal effectiveness. Liking a method doesn't guarantee it's the best one for actually mastering the material.
And that's huge. Okay, let's pivot slightly and connect this directly to language learning, because intuitively it makes sense, right? If I think I'm an auditory learner, I'll load up on podcasts for my French lessons.
It certainly has that surface appeal, absolutely. You know, visual learners might grab the flashcards, auditory learners hit the audio courses, kinesthetic learners maybe try acting out dialogues or using gestures.
But given this lack of scientific backing we just discussed, is focusing only on my supposed style the best way to learn a language?
Well, this brings us to another important concept our source mentions, multimodal learning.
Multimodal, what does that mean?
Multimodal means using several different forms of communication or expression, multiple modes. And what the research actually suggests is that for something complex like language acquisition, a multimodal approach, one that engages multiple senses and uses various methods, is generally more effective than sticking rigidly to one supposed style.
So hitting the language from different angles, basically.
Exactly. The source gives an example. A multimodal approach to language learning includes videos, speaking, and reading. You're seeing it, hearing it, maybe saying it, reading it.
Like using all the tools in the toolbox, not just your favorite hammer.
That's a great analogy. Instead of just listening to podcasts because you think you're auditory, you'd likely benefit more by also reading the transcript, maybe looking up new words, perhaps trying to use those words in conversation later.
So engaging multiple pathways in the brain helps things stick better.
That's the idea. It creates richer connections, deeper processing. Now, because the learning styles idea is so popular, despite the evidence, there are naturally some common misunderstandings floating around.
Okay. Myth-busting time. Let's tackle some of those common misconceptions. What's myth number one?
A really big one is the idea that everyone has one fixed learning style, that you're born a visual learner, and that's just how you are permanently.
And the truth is?
The truth, as our material points out, is that learning is much more fluid and context dependent. People are adaptable. We use different strategies depending on what we're learning, why we're learning it, and the specific task.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, I might prefer reading to understand, say, a historical event, but if I'm learning to tie a knot, I definitely want to watch someone do it kinesthetic and visual, right?
Exactly. You adapt. You're not locked into one mode.
Okay. Myth number two.
What's the next big one? That matching the teaching method to your supposed learning style automatically improves performance. If I'm a visual learner, visual teaching will make me learn better.
And we've kind of covered this, but let's reiterate the truth.
The truth is, as we discussed with the Pashler review, there's just no solid scientific proof for this matching hypothesis. You might enjoy the matched method more.
Right, preference again.
But enjoyment doesn't reliably translate into better learning outcomes, like higher test scores or better long-term retention.
Okay. So just because I like learning vocabulary through games doesn't mean it's necessarily the most effective way for me to actually remember those words compared to, say, spaced repetition flashcards, even if I find those less fun.
Precisely. Fun and effectiveness aren't always the same thing in learning. Okay, myth number 3.
What's the third big misconception?
This one's quite important. The idea that you should actively avoid learning methods that don't match your preferred style.
Oh, so if I think I'm auditory, I should steer clear of reading material.
Exactly that kind of thinking. The truth, our source argues, is that doing so can actually limit your growth. Avoiding other methods prevents you from developing potentially valuable skills and strategies.
It keeps you in a comfort zone that might not be the best place for learning.
Right. Exposure to a variety of methods, even those you initially find challenging or less preferable, helps build more robust, well-rounded skills. You might even discover a non-preferred method is surprisingly effective for certain things.
So if I think, oh, I'm terrible at speaking practice, I'm not a speaking learner, actively avoiding it is probably the worst thing I could do for my language progress.
Absolutely. Pushing yourself to engage with different modalities, even uncomfortable ones, is often where the real learning happens. It builds flexibility.
Okay, so if focusing narrowly on these styles isn't the way to go, what are the better alternatives? Where should learners focus their energy instead?
Our source points to a couple of really promising areas. First up is something called cognitive load theory.
Cognitive load theory. Sounds a bit technical.
It does, but the core idea is quite practical. It's basically about our working memory, the mental scratch pad we use to process information right now. It has a limited capacity. Cognitive load theory suggests that effective learning materials and teaching methods should be designed to avoid overwhelming that working memory with unnecessary stuff, extraneous load, they call it.
So making sure the information is presented clearly, without lots of distracting bells and whistles, so your brain can actually focus on understanding the important parts.
Exactly. Breaking complex ideas down, providing clear explanations, scaffolding learning. It's about managing the load on working memory, so information can be processed effectively and moved into long-term memory. It's less about catering to a style and more about efficient information design for everyone.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about the teaching, not just the learner's supposed type. What's the other alternative mentioned?
The other one is metacognition.
Metacognition, another big word.
It is, but again, a really useful concept. Simply put, metacognition is thinking about your own thinking.
Thinking about thinking.
Yeah. It's about being aware of your own learning process, understanding what strategies work well for you in specific situations, monitoring your comprehension, and knowing how to adjust your approach when you're struggling.
So it's more active and self-aware than just saying, I'm a visual learner.
Much more active. Instead of relying on a fixed label, a metacognitive learner reflects on their experiences. Our source gives a great example.
Yeah, I like this one.
Instead of saying, I'm a visual learner, a metacognitive thinker says something like, I seem to remember that vocabulary better last week when I used those picture flashcards. Maybe I should try that again for this set.
It's specific, it's based on actual experience, and it leads to an action. It's not just a label.
Precisely. It's about developing self-awareness as a learner and using that awareness to make informed, flexible decisions about how you learn best, task by task. It's much more empowering than a fixed style.
Okay, that feels way more practical. Now, before we move to wrapping up, the source had that vocabulary recap. Can we quickly run through those key terms again, just to cement them?
Good idea. So we had absorb, to take in information, like absorbing vocabulary. Got it. Retain, to keep or remember information, like retaining grammar rules.
Yep.
Empirical, based on observation or experiment, and there's little empirical evidence for learning styles.
Right.
Metacognition, thinking about your own thinking and learning processes.
Okay.
And multimodal, using several different ways to learn or communicate, like using videos, speaking, and reading for language learning.
Perfect. That's a helpful summary. And there was also that short dialogue, wasn't there, between Sarah and Mark about learning English?
Yes. Their conversation really illustrated a lot of what we've been discussing.
How so? What were the key takeaways from their chat?
Well, Mark starts off thinking he's primarily an auditory learner, relying heavily on podcasts. That's the initial belief in a style.
Okay.
Sarah mentions preferring writing things down for retention, another preference. They briefly touch on that common idea. Does matching style improve skills? Which, as we've seen, is questionable. But then what's interesting is Sarah talks about how she's actually started mixing it up, using videos, reading, speaking, and feels it's more effective for her now. That's moving towards multimodal.
So she evolved her approach based on experience.
Exactly. And Mark, hearing this, starts thinking maybe he should try different things too, especially speaking, which he finds hard. He's considering moving beyond his initial auditory label.
So their little exchange perfectly shows that shift, doesn't it? From a fixed style mindset towards a more flexible, experimental, maybe even metacognitive approach.
Precisely. It's a neat practical example of questioning the rigid learning styles idea and embracing adaptability, especially for something multifaceted like language.
Okay, so if we were to boil this all down, the big message seems to be that whole idea of having one fixed learning style you need to cater to, it sounds nice.
Maybe.
It's appealing, yeah. But the science doesn't really back it up strongly. A more flexible, experimental, multimodal approach is likely more effective, especially for languages.
That's the main takeaway. It's less about figuring out your type and more about actively discovering what combination of methods works best for you through trial, error, and reflection.
And our source wraps up with some really good reflective questions for listeners, doesn't it? Things to ask yourself.
It does. Like, what methods help you learn English most effectively? Think about your actual experiences.
Do you tend to stick to just one style, or do you use a variety of approaches? Be honest with yourself.
And this is a great one. Have you ever tried a learning method that actually surprised you with how well it worked? Maybe something outside your usual comfort zone.
Those are excellent questions for self-reflection. Really gets you thinking metacognitively.
It really does. And maybe that leads to the final thought here. Perhaps the most valuable thing isn't labeling what kind of learner you are,
Right.
but developing a better understanding of how you learn, how you focus, how you remember, what clicks for different types of tasks, seeing learning as this ongoing journey of discovery about yourself.
So focusing on the process of learning, using that metacognition we talked about, rather than getting stuck on a label.
Exactly. By being open, by experimenting, by paying attention to what actually works for you, you might unlock ways of learning you never thought possible and build much stronger, more versatile skills in the long run.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we are going to tackle something that's been in the headlines for, well, quite a while now, and that's the global refugee crisis. I mean, we've all seen the news reports. We know the numbers are just, well, frankly, they're immense. But what we want to do today is really go beyond those headlines and those big numbers and get into the heart of the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just about kind of feeling bad, right? We're going to try to really pull out the key insights from this document we've been looking at. It really lays out the whole situation. It defines what a refugee actually is, the sheer scale of this crisis, the reasons why people are being displaced, and what happens, the ripple effects when millions are forced from their homes.
So it's like a deep dive right into the core of the refugee crisis, going from the basic definition all the way to the responsibilities we all have as a global community.
Exactly. And the document we're using is really thorough. It starts right at the beginning with the very definition of a refugee. So maybe that's a good place for us to start. Like, what is a refugee in very precise terms?
Right, because I think that term gets thrown around a lot and not always accurately. Let's get specific here.
Right. So at its heart, the definition really hinges on this element of force. A refugee is someone who is forced to flee their own country because they have a very real and justified fear of being persecuted. And this persecution, it can be based on so many things: their race, their religion, their nationality, what social groups they belong to, or their political opinions.
So it's not just about fleeing war, though that's obviously a huge part of it.
Exactly. War and widespread violence, they definitely fall under this umbrella. They create situations so dangerous that people have no choice but to leave if they want to survive. It's important to understand that this isn't about people just choosing to move for better economic opportunities. It's about fleeing from very real danger.
That distinction is so important. It's about an immediate threat to their safety, to their lives. Can you give us a concrete example, something that really illustrates this?
Sure. Imagine someone living in a country in the midst of a brutal civil war. Their neighborhood is a war zone, there's no basic services, violence is a constant threat. To escape this immediate danger, to simply survive, they cross a border into a neighboring country seeking safety. That person would very likely be considered a refugee.
Okay, that definitely paints a vivid picture of the desperation involved. Now, we often hear the term refugee alongside other related terms, like asylum, displacement, exile. Can you walk us through some of these, help us understand the differences?
Of course, of course. Let's start with asylum. Asylum is essentially the protection a country offers to someone who has fled their own country and is seeking refuge within its borders because of those dangers we talked about. Our source actually mentions people seeking asylum in Germany after facing political violence back home. So seeking asylum is a formal process of requesting that protection.
Okay, so asylum is that formal request and hopefully the granting of protection by a new country. What about displacement? We hear that a lot too.
Displacement is a much broader term. It really covers any kind of forced movement of people from their homes. It can happen within a country's borders, in which case we call those people internally displaced persons or IDPs, or, as we discussed earlier, it can be across international borders, which is where the term refugee often applies. Sadly, conflict zones are often where we see huge numbers of people being displaced, both within their countries and across borders.
So displacement is the act of being forced to leave your home, regardless of whether you cross a border or not. And then we have exile. Where does that fit in?
Exile is a bit different. It refers to being barred from returning to your own country or choosing to live somewhere else, often for political reasons or, fear of what might happen if you go back. Our document mentions people living in exile because of their activism, for example. It can be a formal ban imposed by the government or a voluntary decision based on a very real fear of persecution if they return.
So just to be clear, a refugee is specifically someone fleeing across a border because of persecution or violence. Exile can be either forced or voluntary, and it doesn't always mean crossing a border because of that same kind of immediate danger. That's helpful. Thanks for clarifying those terms. Now let's talk about the sheer scale of this crisis, the numbers, because they're pretty overwhelming.
They are immense. There's no other way to put it. Recent data from the UNHCR, and this is cited in our document, shows that we're talking about over 110 million people worldwide who have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Think about that for a second. That's a population roughly the size of Japan. And within that huge number, there are about 35 million who are recognized as refugees, meaning they've crossed international borders and are seeking that international protection we talked about.
110 million displaced, 35 million refugees. I mean, wow, comparing it to a whole country's population really puts it into perspective. Can you tell us a bit about where these refugees are primarily coming from?
The document points to Syria, Afghanistan, and Venezuela as consistently being among the top countries of origin. And sadly, this reflects the long-running conflicts, the political instability, and the humanitarian crises that have been plaguing these places for years.
Syria, Afghanistan, Venezuela, places we see in the news all the time for all the wrong reasons. So this brings us to the big why. Why are so many people being forced to flee their homes? What are the main drivers of this global refugee crisis?
Well, the document lays out several key factors, and right at the top of the list is, of course, armed conflict and war. When a country descends into that level of widespread violence, the safety and security of its people are completely shattered. And for huge numbers of people, fleeing for their lives becomes the only option.
And the Syrian civil war, that's a heartbreaking example of this, isn't it? Over 13 million people displaced since it began in 2011. The human cost of that single conflict is almost impossible to grasp. The document also mentions terms like insurgency and ceasefire in this context. Can you explain those a bit?
Sure. Insurgency refers to, often violent uprisings against the established authority within a country. These insurgencies can really drag on, and as the document points out, they can destabilize whole regions, creating this atmosphere of fear and insecurity that just forces people to leave. And even a ceasefire, which is supposed to be a pause in the fighting, well, it's often fragile. It doesn't mean the underlying problems are solved, so people might not be able to go home, even if the guns are temporarily silent.
So even a lull in the fighting doesn't necessarily mean it's safe to go back or that people can start rebuilding their lives. Another major cause you mentioned is political persecution. What does that actually look like in practice? What kinds of situations force people to flee because of their political beliefs?
Political persecution basically means being treated unjustly and harmfully because of your political views, affiliations, or activities. This can range from systematic discrimination and harassment to, much more serious things. Being arrested for no real reason, being imprisoned, tortured, or even killed by the government. The example the document gives, journalists and opposition leaders seeking asylum, that's a very common scenario. These people often face enormous risks. just for expressing views that the government doesn't like, or for holding those in power accountable.
Yeah, it's a scary thought, the dangers faced by people who are simply trying to speak out for change or hold different political opinions. And those related terms the document uses, oppression and tyranny, they really highlight how serious this can get.
Absolutely. Oppression is a broader term. It means prolonged and unjust treatment or control by those in power. And tyranny, well, that takes it a step further. It describes a cruel, absolute ruler who abuses their power, often brutally. Living under that kind of regime, sometimes for decades, it can leave people with no other choice but to seek refuge in a country that respects their basic rights.
It's clear that conflict and political persecution are major drivers, but the document also mentions human rights violations as a significant factor. What specific types of violations are we talking about here?
Some of the most egregious examples, things like ethnic cleansing, torture, and forced labor. These are severe violations of basic human rights. They create an environment of terror and insecurity, leaving people feeling that they have to escape. And it's often systematic, targeted at whole communities.
These are truly horrific things, and the vocabulary associated with this, terms like genocide and persecution, they carry so much weight, so much history.
Absolutely. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic attempt to wipe out a whole group of people. National, ethnic, racial, or religious. And persecution, that's a broader term, but it covers any kind of hostility and ill treatment directed at someone because of their race, religion, politics, you name it. Sadly, the threat of these things, or the actual experience of them, is a major factor driving people to become refugees.
It's a pretty grim picture so far. But it's not just human actions that are displacing people, is it? The document also talks about the role of natural disasters and climate change.
Right, that's a growing piece of this puzzle.
Right.
You have the sudden onset disasters, massive floods, hurricanes, earthquakes. Those can instantly make whole areas uninhabitable, forcing people to flee. But then you have the more gradual but equally devastating impacts of climate change. Droughts that drag on, desertification, rising sea levels. These things can destroy livelihoods, create huge shortages of resources, and ultimately force communities to migrate to find somewhere they can actually survive.
And this is where we hear terms like environmental refugees or climate refugees, right? People displaced not by war or persecution, but by the effects of environmental change. Like the example in the document, an island community forced to leave after being repeatedly hit by increasingly strong hurricanes, or, the slower-moving crisis of a prolonged drought that forces farmers to abandon their land. It's equally devastating in its own way.
Absolutely. The traditional legal definition of a refugee, it focuses mostly on persecution, but the reality is that environmental factors are playing a bigger and bigger role in this crisis. It's a complex area, and the laws around protecting those displaced by these factors are still being developed.
Okay, so we've talked about who refugees are, the immense scale of this crisis, the incredibly complex and often horrifying causes. But now we need to talk about the consequences. What happens when millions of people are forced to leave their homes and seek refuge elsewhere? Let's start with the social impact, the impact on the countries receiving these refugees.
The social impact can be huge, and it plays out in many different ways. One immediate impact, especially when you have a sudden influx of refugees, is the pressure it puts on public services. Healthcare systems, housing, schools, they can struggle to cope with the increased demand. That can lead to challenges for both the host community and the refugees themselves.
Makes sense. Resources get stretched thin. The document also talks about integration challenges. What are some of the biggest hurdles refugees face when they're trying to integrate into a new society?
Integration is a complicated process. It takes time. Language barriers are a big one. Not speaking the language can make it really hard to find work, get an education, access services. Cultural differences can also lead to misunderstandings and difficulties in everyday life. And we can't forget the trauma. Many refugees have experienced horrific things, both back home and during their journey. That trauma can have a lasting impact, and it needs to be addressed. The document stresses that how well refugees are able to integrate often depends on the support they receive from the host community.
But sadly, as the document points out, all of this, the pressure on resources, the integration challenges, it can sometimes fuel negative feelings and lead to a rise in, xenophobia.
Yeah, That's unfortunately a common and very troubling consequence. Xenophobia, it's the fear or hatred of foreigners. And it can get worse when there are anxieties about things like competition for resources, cultural differences, and whether the newcomers will change the society. This can lead to refugees being marginalized, excluded, and in some cases, it can even contribute to social unrest. It creates even more hardship for people who are already incredibly vulnerable.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the economic consequences. What kind of impact does a large influx of refugees have on the economy of a host country?
Well, the economic impact is complicated. There are different ways to look at it. On the one hand, refugees can contribute to the economy. They can fill gaps in the labor market, bring in new skills, start businesses. The document talks about remittances, the money that migrants send back to their families in their home countries. That's money flowing out of the host country. But it also shows that refugees are working and earning.
So there's potential for them to make a positive economic contribution. But the document also uses the term economic burden, which suggests a different perspective. What are the concerns there?
Right. The concern there is usually about the immediate costs, providing for the basic needs of newly arrived refugees, things like housing, food, healthcare, social assistance that cost money. And it often means increased government spending. But the long-term impact really depends on how well refugees are able to integrate into the workforce, into the economy as a whole. Things like access to education, language training, and recognition of their qualifications from back home, those are all crucial factors.
So the economic impact is more than just a simple cost-benefit analysis. It's dynamic, it evolves over time, and it's affected by policies and social factors. Now let's shift gears and talk about the political consequences. How does a refugee crisis tend to change the political landscape of a host country?
Well, politically, a large influx of refugees can definitely lead to some major policy shifts, especially when it comes to immigration and border control. You often see governments tightening up border security, making it more difficult to get in, and changing asylum laws to try to manage the flow of people. And there's often a rise in nationalist sentiment, and populist movements can gain traction. They often exploit public anxieties about immigration, national identity, the idea of us versus them.
The document mentions sovereignty concerns in this context. What does that mean, and why are these concerns often tied to the issue of refugees?
Sovereignty is this idea that a country has ultimate control over its own territory and its own affairs. Governments see controlling their borders, deciding who comes in and who goes out, as a fundamental part of their sovereignty. So when there's a large and unplanned influx of refugees, it can be seen as a threat to that control, and that sparks political debate and tension.
The document also mentions detention centers. What role do those play in the refugee crisis?
Detention centers are places where asylum seekers and people who have entered a country without permission are held, either while their claims are processed or while they're waiting to be deported. They're very controversial. Human rights groups often criticize the conditions in these centers, how long people are held there, and the impact it has on their well-being. The argument for using them is usually about border security and making sure asylum claims are processed efficiently, but there's a strong counter-argument that it violates the rights of the detainees.
So the consequences of a refugee crisis go way beyond the immediate humanitarian needs. It creates these complex challenges for host countries socially, economically, and politically. So with all that in mind, what kind of solutions are being proposed? How can the global community share responsibility for addressing this crisis?
Solving this crisis requires a coordinated effort. It needs international cooperation at every level. The document emphasizes the role of organizations like the UNHCR, as well as NGOs and individual governments. They need to work together. This means things like providing humanitarian aid, sharing the responsibility for resettling refugees in different countries, and investing in long-term solutions that address the root causes of displacement back in the countries of origin.
You mentioned resettlement and humanitarian aid. Can you unpack those terms a bit?
Resettlement is when refugees are transferred from the first country they sought asylum in to a third country that has agreed to give them permanent residence and protection. It's a vital lifeline for refugees who can't stay safely in their current host country and can't go back home. And humanitarian aid is that immediate assistance provided to people and communities affected by crises, including refugees. This is the basic stuff: food, water, shelter, medical care, sanitation.
So there's a huge need for these big-picture international efforts, but the document also stresses the importance of local communities.
Absolutely. The actions of local communities, how welcoming and supportive they are, can make a huge difference in helping refugees rebuild their lives. There's so much that can be done. Volunteering time and resources, providing language tutoring, organizing cultural exchange programs to break down barriers and build understanding. Even just offering friendship and making people feel welcome can have a big impact.
That brings to mind the ideas of empathy and advocacy.
Right. Empathy, being able to understand and share the feelings of others, is crucial for building bridges between refugees and the communities they arrive in. When people can connect on a human level, it creates a much more welcoming and inclusive environment. And advocacy, speaking out in support of a cause or a group, that's also crucial. In the context of refugees, advocacy means raising awareness, challenging those negative stereotypes we talked about, and pushing for fairer and more humane policies.
So it seems like the answer lies not just in big policy decisions, but also in individual actions, community involvement, and just basic human compassion. Now, before we wrap up, the document touches briefly on the importance of language and grammar when we're talking about this issue. Why is that relevant?
When you delve into this topic, you encounter a lot of specialized vocabulary. Terms like persecution, displacement, resettlement, xenophobia, humanitarian, they all have very specific meanings, and understanding those meanings is key to grasping the complexity of the issue. And the way we talk about these issues, the language we use, it can have a real impact on how the public perceives them and on what kinds of policies are put in place.
It's like even the words we choose reflect our underlying perspectives and can shape the whole conversation. The document also mentions some specific grammatical structures that come up often when discussing refugees.
Yeah, it points out that we often use modal verbs like should and must when we talk about solutions, like governments should provide more funding, or the international community must ensure access to aid. And the passive voice is often used, especially in news reports, when describing what's happening to refugees, like thousands of people have been displaced by the conflict. Understanding those grammatical choices can help us be more critical of the information we're reading or hearing.
So being aware of the language being used, both the vocabulary and the grammar, can help us understand the different perspectives and biases that might be at play.
Exactly. Clear and accurate language is essential for having an informed public conversation.
Okay, let's take a moment to recap what we've covered in this deep dive. We started with the very definition of a refugee, explored the sheer scale of global displacement, and delved into the many causes, from armed conflict and political persecution to human rights violations and the increasing impact of environmental change. We then moved on to the consequences, looking at the social, economic, and political challenges that arise in host countries. And finally, we talk about the importance of international cooperation, local community support, and individual empathy in addressing this incredibly complex crisis.
We hope that this deep dive has given you a more nuanced and well-rounded understanding of this issue, something that goes beyond the headlines and sound bites.
And as a final thought for you to consider, in a world that's so interconnected, how can your own actions, even small ones, affect the lives of refugees and the well-being of the communities receiving them? Whether it's educating yourself, supporting local initiatives, challenging negative stereotypes, your choices matter. It's a big question, but one worth thinking about long after this deep dive is over. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, so you guys have sent in like a ton of stuff on this whole cross-cultural communication thing.
Yeah, a lot of interest in this topic.
Yeah, and we want to make sure we pull out the stuff that's going to be most helpful, right? Like, how do we make you like immediately better at this, you know? Because it's a pretty complex area.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that, as the world gets more and more interconnected, it becomes increasingly important, I think.
And you've been thinking about this a lot, clearly, so we want to make sure we go beyond just like the basics and, really try to unpack some of the more complicated stuff too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to sort of intellectually know that people from different cultures communicate differently.
Yeah.
But when you actually get into the specifics of it and you start to see how those differences can play out in real world situations, it can be really eye-opening.
Totally. So before we jump in, let's just level set. I guess, what are we even talking about when we say cross-cultural communication? I mean, what's the big idea here?
Right, so at its most basic level, it's about how people from different cultures exchange information.
Okay, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but it's a lot more than just like, the words themselves.
Right.
It's about understanding all the stuff that lies beneath the surface, like all those unspoken cultural norms, the beliefs, the values, and just the whole range of ways that people communicate, both verbally and non-verbally.
And this stuff is so important now, right? It's not just some like theoretical thing.
Yeah, your sources really emphasize that with, the rise of the global economy and more people traveling and working across borders.
Yeah.
And of course, digital communication is just exploding all the time.
Yeah, we're all connected now, basically.
Right. It's like cross-cultural communication isn't just a nice to have anymore. It's like table stakes for being successful in so many different areas of life.
For sure. And I think what everyone wants is to avoid those like cringy moments, where you just feel like something went wrong in a conversation or you totally missed the mark.
Yeah, or when a message gets completely lost in translation.
Exactly. So your materials point to a bunch of common challenges that people run into, and we're going to focus on those.
Yeah.
Like, what are the pitfalls? What are the things to watch out for? And more importantly, how do we actually get better at navigating these complexities?
Yeah, let's dive in. Okay, so a good place to start is with maybe the most obvious challenge, which is language barriers.
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty basic, but...
Right, but it's not just about whether or not two people technically speak the same language. It's about fluency levels. And even more subtly, I think it's about the use of idioms.
That's a good point. Because you can know the words, but if you don't know the meaning behind the words...
Like, if someone says, let's touch base next week, and you're not a native English speaker, you might be like, what are they talking about? We're not playing baseball.
Right, and it's such a common phrase for us, like we don't even think about it.
Right.
But it's a perfect example of how easily communication can break down when you're relying on those kind of unspoken cultural understandings.
Yeah, and this leads to what your sources call misinterpretation, which is basically just a simple misunderstanding of the intended meaning.
Right.
And it can also create ambiguity where there are multiple possible interpretations of what's being said.
Oh, I see.
Which is like the opposite of what you want in effective communication.
Yeah, for sure. It's like you think you're on the same page, but you're actually miles apart.
Totally.
Okay, so language is a big one. What about all that nonverbal stuff? That seems like a huge area where cultural differences can really trip people up.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, nonverbal communication is so powerful, and so much of it happens below our conscious awareness.
Right, like we're not even thinking about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's so culturally specific. I mean, take something as simple as eye contact.
Yeah, I was fascinated by that example you sent where in some cultures, like many Asian cultures, avoiding direct eye contact is actually a sign of respect, particularly when you're talking to someone in a position of authority.
Right.
But then, in a lot of Western cultures, that same behavior could be interpreted as like shyness or even dishonesty.
Yeah, talk about mixed messages.
Right. It's like the same behavior, completely different meanings depending on the cultural context.
Yeah. And then you've got things like gestures.
Right.
Which are basically movements we make with our hands or head to convey an idea. I mean, the thumbs up might be universally positive, right?
Well, I thought so.
But in some cultures, it can actually be quite offensive.
Yeah.
And then there's proxemics, which is all about personal space.
Oh, yeah. Some people like to get up close and personal.
Right. And what feels like a comfortable distance in one culture might feel way too close or too distant in another.
So you could be trying to be friendly, but actually making someone super uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's like there's this whole silent language we're all speaking. And if you're not fluent in it, you're going to miss a lot of the meaning.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so we've got language, we've got nonverbal cues. What about stereotypes? I feel like that's another big one that can really get in the way of effective communication.
Yeah, stereotypes are tricky because they're often based on some kernel of truth.
Right, like there are cultural tendencies.
Exactly. But the problem is that we tend to overgeneralize and apply those tendencies to individuals without considering all the individual variation that exists within any cultural group.
Your example about German punctuality was a good one. There's a stereotype that Germans are always on time.
Yeah, and while it's true that punctuality is generally valued in German culture,
right,
assuming that every single German person you meet is going to be precisely on time is just a ridiculous oversimplification.
Totally. And it's just lazy thinking, right?
Yeah.
It's way easier to put people in boxes than to actually engage with them as individuals.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that stereotypes can lead to what your sources call bias, which is essentially an unfair prejudice or preconceived notion about a person or group.
Right, and bias can have real-world consequences. It can affect how we perceive people, how we treat them, and it can really perpetuate inequality and injustice.
Exactly. So being aware of our own biases and actively challenging those stereotypes is crucial for effective cross-cultural communication.
So much of this is about being self-aware, right? Like noticing those knee-jerk reactions we have and questioning them.
Yeah, it's about being mindful and intentional in our interactions with others.
Totally. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about how people actually structure their communication. Like, are there different styles of communication that can lead to misunderstandings?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the biggest distinctions your sources highlighted was the difference between direct and indirect communication styles.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, in cultures that value direct communication, like the US or Germany,
Right.
being clear and straightforward, even when you're expressing disagreement or criticism, is often seen as honest and efficient.
Just get to the point.
Right. But in cultures that favor indirect communication, like Japan or Korea,
Okay.
maintaining harmony and saving face are often prioritized. So people tend to be more subtle and nuanced in their language, especially when they're expressing a negative opinion.
So like beating around the bush a little bit?
In a way, yeah. It's not about being dishonest, but about preserving relationships and avoiding confrontation.
Right, and the example in your materials about saying no was really illuminating.
Yeah, like in a direct culture, you might just say, no, that won't work.
Right.
But in an indirect culture, you might hear something like, we'll have to look into that further, or maybe we can explore some other options.
And it's not that they're necessarily saying yes.
Right. The underlying message might be the same, but the way it's expressed is totally different.
So if you're not attuned to those subtle cues, you could easily misinterpret what's being said.
Exactly. And this is all tied to the concepts of high context and low context cultures.
Okay, I've heard of those, but I'm not sure I totally get the distinction.
So in a high context culture, a lot of the meaning is conveyed through implicit cues like shared cultural knowledge, nonverbal signals, and the overall context of the situation.
So it's like reading between the lines.
Yeah, exactly. Less is explicitly stated because there's this assumption of shared understanding.
And these are often cultures with long histories and strong traditions, right?
Yeah, think of Japan or China or many Middle Eastern cultures. In contrast, low context cultures like the US or Germany tend to rely on more explicit and direct communication.
So you say what you mean and you mean what you say.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Information is spelled out more clearly, and there's less reliance on unspoken understandings.
Okay, so that's a fundamental difference that can lead to a lot of confusion if you're not aware of it.
For sure.
Okay, what about time? I mean, I know different cultures have really different attitudes towards time.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
What's considered on time or how strictly people adhere to schedules varies wildly across cultures.
Right, like in your example about German punctuality versus a more relaxed approach to time in some Latin American cultures.
Exactly. And it can be a major source of friction if you're coming from a culture where being on time is super important and you're interacting with someone who has a more fluid concept of time.
Yeah, you could end up feeling really disrespected or like the other person doesn't value your time.
Right, and vice versa. The person who's more relaxed about time might see you as uptight and inflexible.
So how do we make sense of these different perspectives on time?
Well, this is where the study of chronemics comes in, which is basically how we perceive and use time in communication.
Okay.
So some cultures are considered monochronic.
Monochronic.
Yeah, which means people tend to focus on one task at a time. They value schedules and deadlines, and they see time as linear and finite.
Okay.
Other cultures are more polychronic, which means they're more comfortable. Multitasking schedules are more flexible, and relationships and context often take precedence over strict adherence to time.
So like a monochronic person might view a polychronic person as disorganized and unreliable.
Right.
And the polychronic person might see the monochronic person as rigid and impersonal.
Yeah, it's all about perspective and understanding where the other person is coming from.
Totally. Okay, so we've covered language, nonverbal cues, stereotypes, communication styles, and perceptions of time. What else do we need to be aware of?
Well, your sources also touched on how power dynamics influence communication, specifically the difference between hierarchical and egalitarian cultures.
Oh, right. That makes sense because in some cultures, respect for authority is like deeply ingrained.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that respect dictates how people communicate with each other, especially across different levels of seniority or status.
So like your example of an Indian employee being less likely to openly question a manager compared to a Swedish junior employee who might feel more comfortable sharing their opinions.
Yeah, that illustrates the concept of power distance,
Okay.
which basically refers to the extent to which less powerful members of a society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally.
So in cultures with high power distance,
Right.
there's a greater acceptance of hierarchy and deference to authority is expected.
Exactly. Whereas in more egalitarian cultures, power distance is lower, and there's more emphasis on equal participation and open communication, regardless of someone's position or status.
Gotcha. So what might be seen as respectful in a hierarchical culture could be perceived as passive or even submissive in a more egalitarian one.
Right, and it's important to be sensitive to those differences in communication norms.
Totally.
Yeah.
So basically what you're saying is that cross-cultural communication is really complicated.
Well, it is nuanced. That's a good word for it.
Nuance, okay.
Yeah, it means like subtle differences in meaning or expression.
Right.
Like you could completely miss the cultural nuance in someone's tone of voice or a seemingly small gesture and totally misinterpret their message.
And I guess that's where empathy comes in.
Oh, absolutely. Empathy is crucial for bridging cultural divides.
Empathy. So like the ability to understand and share the feelings of others.
Right. It's about putting yourself in someone else's shoes and trying to see the world from their perspective.
And without empathy, we're way more likely to make assumptions and act on those assumptions.
Yeah, we might operate based on misconceptions, which are basically incorrect beliefs or understandings.
Like that example you gave about silence. The misconception that silence always equals agreement.
Exactly. In some cultures, silence might signify contemplation or respect or even indirect disagreement.
Right. It's not a universal yes.
Nope.
And to be effective in these cross-cultural situations, we need to be adaptable, right?
Oh, for sure. Adaptability is key.
So being able to adjust to new cultural environments and behaviors.
Yeah, like if you're living or working abroad or even just interacting with people from different backgrounds online.
Right.
Being able to flex your style and adapt to different ways of communicating is essential.
And I guess this is where that idea of cultural intelligence comes in.
Yeah, CQ, cultural intelligence.
So it's not just about knowing stuff about different cultures, but it's about having the skills to actually apply that knowledge in real-world situations.
Exactly. It's about being able to read the room, so to speak, and adjust your behavior accordingly.
So someone with high CQ is going to be more effective at navigating those complex cultural dynamics.
Right, they're going to be better at building relationships, resolving conflicts, and just generally communicating more effectively across cultures.
Okay, so let's bring this all together and look at some real-life examples, because I think that's where the rubber really meets the road.
Yeah, absolutely. So your sources include a couple of great scenarios that illustrate some of these challenges in action.
Let's start with that one about the compliment.
Right, so in this scenario, Anna, who's from the US, compliments Lee, who's from China, on her English. She says, "Your English is amazing."
Okay.
And Lee responds with, "It's not that good."
And I bet Anna's a little taken aback by that.
Yeah, like most Americans would probably interpret that response as false modesty or even a bit rude.
Right.
But in many East Asian cultures, deflecting a compliment is actually a sign of humility and politeness.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, directly accepting praise can be seen as arrogant or boastful.
So Lee's response was actually perfectly appropriate in her cultural context.
Exactly. But without that understanding, Anna might have walked away feeling like her compliment wasn't well received.
Totally. Okay, let's look at that other scenario, the one about direct versus indirect communication.
Yeah, so in this one, Carlos, who's from Mexico, expresses his disagreement pretty directly. He says, "I don't think that's a good idea."
Straight to the point.
Right. But then Yuki, who's from Japan, expresses a similar reservation, but she does it much more indirectly. She says something like, "Maybe we can consider a different option."
Okay, so she's not saying no outright.
Right, she's implying it.
And someone from a more direct culture might miss that nuance entirely.
Yeah, they might think Yuki is just being wishy-washy or that she doesn't have a strong opinion.
Right.
But in Japanese culture, preserving harmony and avoiding direct confrontation is often highly valued. So Yuki's approach is actually quite skillful and diplomatic.
It's fascinating how much our communication style is shaped by our cultural background.
Yeah, and these are just two small examples. There are countless other ways that cultural differences can play out in communication.
Right, and it's important to remember that every culture is complex and diverse, and there's always individual variation within any group.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But gaining a basic understanding of these potential areas of difference, as we've explored today, is a huge step towards becoming more culturally intelligent and effective communicators.
Totally. So to wrap up, I guess the big takeaway is that cross-cultural communication is not always easy.
Yeah, it takes effort and awareness.
But it's so worth it, because when we can communicate effectively across cultures, we can build stronger relationships, collaborate more effectively, and just create a more inclusive and understanding world.
Absolutely. So as you go out into the world and interact with people from different backgrounds, I want you to think about this. What's a time when you experienced a misunderstanding or maybe witnessed one, and how could a deeper awareness of cultural differences have changed the outcome?
That's a great question to think about.
Yeah, it's something we can all continue to learn and grow from.
Absolutely. Thanks for this deep dive.
My pleasure.